Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Cole, and this is Practical Faith, and I'm excited tonight to be hosting our second live moderated debate. Before we jump into tonight's debate, I want to make an announcement and let everybody know who is interested in debates that we're going to be hosting our third live moderated debate 2 weeks from tomorrow. So this is going to be Nick Quint versus David Lewis on the topic of Romans chapter 7. Is Paul talking about himself? Is he talking about pre-conversion, post-conversion, something else? So that's going to be an exciting one. Recently, I started going through the book of Romans, trying to figure out what's going on, and I just got stuck in Romans 7. So debates are one of the ways that I learn. Hopefully, I'll be able to learn a little bit from that debate. So we're excited about that. That's coming up again in about 2 weeks, 2 weeks from tomorrow. The best way for you to not miss out on that is to subscribe to the channel. And I'm going to post it in about a week as an upcoming event, and you'll be notified if you do that. But getting to tonight's debate, we're excited to have on two special guests. We've got Will Duffy and Colton Carlson. So welcome, guys, to the channel. And we're going to be discussing compatibilism. Is compatibilism rational? And this is something I've been on also for a little while and been interested in. So these guys are way more qualified than I am. So I'm just going to be kind of moderating, and then I'm going to step into the background here in just a minute and let these guys talk for a good little bit. But this isn't in-house discussion. I want to mention that. So this is between brothers. But compatibilists say that free will and determinism are logically compatible with one another. That's a really basic definition of compatibilism. There is a lot to unpack here on these terms. So we're going to let Colton do that in just a minute. So Colton is going to lead off and unpack some of that for about 15 minutes. I'm probably not going to put a timer on him. It's going to be about 15 minutes. This is going to be really informal, more like a discussion than a typical debate. But he's going to be defending the position of compatibilism. And then after that, Will is going to have about 5 minutes to set up his position, ask some questions, and they're just going to talk for close to an hour. And afterwards, we're going to be taking some questions from the audience. So if you're watching live, you can go ahead and even begin asking your questions now. I'm going to take them down and ask them at the end here. So with all of that out of the way, I'm going to have Will go ahead and introduce himself, and then Colton, and we'll get started. So Will, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell people how they can get a hold of you, or websites, or whatever.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting and having me. Looking forward to this. I own and operate opentheism.org along with Pastor Bob Enyart. A lot of good information on there, and we have an easy way to contact us if you have any questions or have any thoughts.
Awesome. Thank you, brother. And I am going to put all of the information, contact stuff, anything that they give me in the description. So if you're watching later, not live, then you should be able to go to the description and get that. And also, I'm going to be pinning a comment to the top of the comment section with timestamps. Now, this is not going to be, like the formal debate, but I'll just have this is where you can go to check out the audience Q&A and, stuff like that. So you can look for that if you're watching later, not live. Colton, rather go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, so I'm a Calvinist, and I've been a believer for about 10, 11 years. But I wasn't always Calvinist, actually. I became Calvinist from an Arminian church when I was in college, actually, through just a series of events. And I was always interested in philosophical apologetics, I guess, but not really apologetics, because I feel like there's not a lot of imagination in apologetics. It's either this or that, And but that kind of what led me into my endeavor to kind of study philosophy in a detailed way. A couple years ago, when I was teaching math, because I'm a full-time mathematics teacher, my principal allowed me to teach an elective class, and I chose philosophy because I figured it wouldn't be that difficult, and I was wrong. And so essentially, it was a 2-year process of me just perfecting my beliefs. I gave up certain beliefs, even in the Calvinistic system. I learned how to just argue pretty well, to have friendly discussions like this, and either in a written format or a verbal format. It was just a really blessed last couple of years, and I'm starting, hopefully, Lord willing, my master's next year in philosophy at Biola University.
Awesome, brother. Well, thank you for coming on. And I'm going to go ahead and let you start your opening for about 15 minutes. So somewhere around the 9:20 mark, if you can kind of wrap it up, and then we'll just get into the open dialogue. So when you come on here, you got about 15 minutes.
All right. Okay, so like I said, I'm a compatibilist, and tonight I will attempt to critique and hopefully issue substantial defeaters for incompatibilism by providing a sound exposition on the philosophical, theological, and biblical data concerning its negation, compatibilism. So as I stated, I am a philosopher, so the audience should not be surprised as I take a method or approach that lays significant emphasis on the supremacy of philosophy and systematic theology and how that relates to the biblical data. Now, I'm not denying sola scriptura or attempting to relay that philosophy is the necessary foundation or replacement of the Christian faith and study. I'm merely taking an approach to systematic theology of Calvinism and providing sound, suitable, tenable, and hopefully reasonably justifiable answers using philosophical means to prove that if incompatibilism is false, Calvinistic compatibilism seems to be the best option. So with that, a few definitions, because those are important. So free will, I would say a person has free will if they have the power or ability to make morally responsible choices. So that is either good or bad choices. So moral responsibility is a person is morally responsible for a given action if and only if that action is morally significant. That means good, bad, right, wrong, blameworthy, praiseworthy. Now, underneath the free will umbrella, we have a couple of things associated with that moral responsibility, and that is epistemic conditions, control conditions, ability, agency, causation, rationality, and honestly, there's a few others, but the one that I'm mostly convinced of that convinces me of compatibilism and that I use quite often is the ability condition, although we'll probably talk about some of the others as well. With that said, the thesis of compatibilism is that determinism is compatible with moral responsibility. Now, if you want to say determinism is compatible with free will, that's fine too. I would just say the only thing necessary about free will is really that moral responsibility part. So note, though, in this thesis, that compatibilism in and of itself says nothing about the truth of either determinism or moral responsibility. It only says and states that both could be true together. So that is to say, if one is a compatibilist, she is not necessarily committed to the truth of determinism, though that usually is the case, but only that moral responsibility and determinism could describe reality, but it may not always describe reality. So with definitions aside, I'll begin with my philosophical understanding of the most infamous incompatibilist argument, and that is the consequence argument. So it really boils down to this one premise. If determinism is true, then people are never morally responsible for their choices or actions. Now, of course, the Calvinist has to deny this. The compatibilist has to deny this because, of course, if we're determined, we do uphold moral responsibility. So Van Inwagen informally puts the consequence argument like this. If determinism is true, then our actions are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our own acts, are not up to us. That's in his essays on free will book. Now, to be brief, I think the consequence argument fails. I didn't give a formal syllogism form, but I could. It fails in one thing, that it simply begs the question in favor of incompatibilism, as it only proves that libertarian free will and determinism cannot be compatible while providing significant moral freedom. But this isn't an argument against compatibilism, because as it stands, the consequence argument is a reductio argument, which means the compatibilist must accept the premises as true when first formulated. If the premises beg the question in favor of libertarian definition of ability, then of course the compatibilist can reject it. In short, Van Inwagen's argument, this comes from Bignon's work, Van Inwagen's argument does not establish incompatibilism, but only that determinism is incompatible with libertarian free will. And since I don't believe in libertarian free will, I don't see how it has any purchase on me. And furthermore, it equivocates, the consequence argument equivocates on two senses of ability. In some of the premises, it uses a categorical ability. Instead, the compatibilist suggests the conditional ability. So it's not quite clear on which ability is necessary for moral responsibility. So this provides us with the helpful analysis that I hope I'll be able to explain really brief on the PAP, the principles of alternative possibilities. What it says is you don't have the ability to do otherwise, therefore you are not free. Well, the compatibilist obviously rejects this. So the categorical ability, a person is morally responsible for what he has done only if all things inside and outside of the person being just as they are at the moment of choice, he could have then done otherwise. So only the categorical ability, as understood from that definition, is incompatible with determinism. So if one assumes the categorical ability in the consequence argument, then sure, it succeeds. However, the incompatibilist cannot assume its truth in the argument, otherwise it remains question begging. The other type of ability is the conditional. A person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise, had his inner desires inclined him to do so at the moment of choice. Again, this comes straight from Bignon's work that I find very helpful. So note that this is not an attempt to define or redefine the words can and ability. Rather, it is merely an attempt to capture one's particular sense of ability and demonstrating which one is therefore necessary for moral responsibility. So for instance, if the incompatibilists may contend that it would be unreasonable to command someone to do something impossible for them to do, because the categorical ability to do otherwise is necessary for freedom underneath their view. So they say it would be like a commanding an armless man to embrace you, or a cat to talk, or something like that. But this is the point. This man could not embrace you even if he had wanted to, and thus securing the conditional ability as a reasonable and necessary foundation for attributing appropriate moral responsibility to agents. So we are not morally responsible when we simply just couldn't have done otherwise. That's the categorical. But rather, we are not morally responsible when even if we had wanted to, we couldn't have done otherwise. That's the conditional. So note again also, and I hope this remains clear, I'm not begging the question, as the shoulders of the shoulders of the burden of proof is actually on the incompatibilists at this moment. So if I just say this is a reasonable solution to escape the problem, I don't need to assert anything more than that. Now, I would be begging the question if I use the conditional analysis in an argument for compatibilism. Okay, but I'm not doing that. I'm just saying, as the burden's on the incompatibilists, this is an escape route, and then I'm perfectly rationally justified in saying that. It is the incompatibilist that needs to rationalize, rationally show that the conditional ability is not meaningful in any real sense. So the consequence argument is an attempt of the incompatibilists. It's an indirect one, but the burden is on them. And all I have to do as a compatibilist is maintain epistemic and skeptical distance by pointing out the begging the question fallacy and the equivocation for ability. So the conditional ability is therefore shown necessary for moral responsibility, because if one tries to negate the conditional ability, they unduly negate the categorical ability, for the categorical ability entails the conditional ability. So you can't have the categorical without the conditional. And that is just a modus tollens straight up argument. Okay. So the ability condition for moral responsibility is thus secured and seemingly compatible with determinism. Now that's for philosophical. It's not an argument. It's just a counter. The theological constraint of compatibilism, I usually pose two things: moral agency in eternity and Luther's Pelagian argument. One is an argument and one is not. One's just kind of a hard press. So the first one is like a hard press on the incompatibilists. So moral agency in eternity for theological reasons. Non-Calvinists will often say, especially if they adhere to some sort of libertarian free will and the pat by extension, that we do possess free will in heaven, that we possess the ability to do otherwise in heaven, but we can't sin in heaven. That's fine, I agree, but I pose the following: if in heaven we are then morally responsible for the class of actions and not the specific actions, then why can't we be morally responsible for the complementary class of action on earth as well? So here's a dilemma posed a little bit more clearly. If we do not possess the categorical ability to do otherwise concerning class actions in heaven, yet we remain morally responsible, then why can't we remain morally responsible on earth while not possessing the categorical ability to do otherwise concerning the complementary class of actions? So if the former obtains, though no true ability to do otherwise exists concerning class actions of goodness in heaven, yet we remain morally responsible, then why does the latter not also obtain in the same complementary or parallel fashion on earth for the class action of sinfulness? So I contend that the latter does obtain, namely we are morally responsible for the class action of sinfulness on earth, and we will still be morally responsible for our class action of goodness in heaven, yet all the while we could not have done otherwise, categorically. Though if this is all true, it does not seem to be compatible with incompatibilism, whereas it is perfectly compatible with theistic compatibilism. Now, for Luther's Pelagian argument, this is not an origination from me, although I'm putting my own spin borrowed from some Bignon's work as well. I have one argument that just is about mainly libertarianism and one that's a reformulation of it. I hope I can get through both. But I won't be defending them. That will be for the discussion. I will just be saying the premises. So premise one, if libertarianism is true, then the principle of alternative possibilities, or the PAP, is therefore true. 2, if the PAP is true, then humans can live a perfect moral life. 3, humans cannot live a perfect moral life. 4, therefore the PAP is false. 5, therefore libertarianism is false. Now you may say, well, I'm not a libertarian, so that's not a problem. Great, like that's true, you're right. So here's a different formulation. If incompatibilism is true for premise 1, then the principle of alternative possibilities is true. 2, if the PAP is true, then humans can live a perfect moral life. But 3, humans cannot live a perfect moral life. Therefore 4, the PAP is false. Therefore 5, incompatibilism is false. Therefore 6, compatibilism is true by definition. For biblical reasons, there's obviously a host, I believe. There's a host of verses that prove compatibilism, but I'm only going to focus on 2. They're kind of cheeky in the sense that they don't directly prove compatibilism, but they mesh well with the compatibilistic thesis. And these are the ones that convince me the most. So James 1, 14 through 15. If the thesis of compatibilism is that determinism and moral responsibility are compatible, in that man's will is defined as doing what one desires as a basis for moral responsibility, then this verse literally indicates just that. We are not morally responsible primarily because we could not have done otherwise, or that we could have done otherwise, but rather we are morally responsible because of the intentions of our desires. The second verse, and this will be the last verse I start with, 2 Peter 1:21. This famous verse is, of course, the inspiration of Scripture verse. The inerrancy, though, of the Scriptures must rest, I believe, on some sort of divine determinism, some sort, okay, in order to ensure that what was written in the autographs were actually what God intended. And this makes sense given compatibilism because God works through man as they were carried along by his Spirit to bring about his word. Anything less should seriously be considered as luck, chance, or otherwise random, even if it's purposed by God. So in conclusion, the conditional ability is proven to be necessary philosophically for moral responsibility and not the categorical, as the consequence argument equivocates between the two. Theologically, if the Luther's Pelagian argument and the moral agency in heaven pushback are sound representations of the thesis of incompatibilism and the necessary consequences thereof, then I believe compatibilism is shown at least to be semi-rational, in that incompatibilists, the position they hold, would severely suffer from these serious defeaters or rebuttals, or at least undercuts. And then biblically, if the philosophical and theological analyses and arguments actually do pull through, as I stated above, it is safe to say that the biblical data can and may cohere well with the thesis of compatibilism, and therefore demonstrates that compatibilism is indeed rational and that the two are not mutually exclusive.
All right, thanks, brother, for that. Hoping this is going to be good. I can tell it's going to be good. And so I am about to back out of here and let you guys just kind of have a conversation for the next hour or so. Will is going to get the first 5 minutes and do some talking, lay some things out, ask some questions, and then just kind of do some back and forth. The only reasons I will come in is if we have some kind of technical issue or something like that, or if someone's hogging all the time or talking over the other person. I don't think that's going to happen. Or if we just like get stuck in one place and just can't seem to move on, I'll just pop in for just a minute, make things a little bit awkward, and then I'll step back out because that's just kind of what I do. So again, if you're watching this live, go ahead and ask your questions because as they talk, I'm going to be watching the comments, and so I'm going to be taking down your questions, and we're going to ask them your questions at the end of about an hour's worth of dialogue. So with all that said, I'm going to try to figure this out here and back out, and then you guys take it away.
Awesome. Hey, Colton, thanks for agreeing to discuss this with me.
Yeah.
We've actually been Facebook friends for a while, but this is the first time I've actually seen your face, because in your profile picture, you're hiding behind your dog.
That's actually my sister's dog, and she's a terror. But yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So you are a philosopher, and I think it's important to note that I am a wannabe philosopher. I love philosophy, and I really became interested in it when I attended a philosophy conference back in Dallas in 2014. I love exercising the mind, and I especially love how philosophers can discuss differing viewpoints without turning it into a debate. I was amazed at how quickly one side would concede a point on the spot, and there wasn't the usual pride that you see in formal debates. That actually changed my life. And since then, I've strived to check myself when I am in a disagreement with someone and not feel the temptation to have to be right or avoid at all costs admitting when I'm wrong or don't have an answer to something. So I really look forward to having a discussion like that with you on this topic.
Appreciate that, brother. Appreciate it.
So I have two goals personally for our discussion. And the first is for people to actually understand Calvinism. I think Calvinism is misunderstood by both non-Calvinists and even Calvinists themselves. I'm sure it's as frustrating for you when a non-Calvinist doesn't understand Calvinism as it is for me when a Calvinist doesn't understand Calvinism. If people walk away from our discussion at least understanding the truth of what Calvinism is and teaches, I think that will be a victory for both sides. You agree?
I do agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And so second, I want people to understand these complex philosophical issues and terms in a way where they feel like they can follow along and not get overwhelmed by the complexity that can quickly arise in philosophical discussions. Philosophers are very bright and often use words that people haven't heard of or are generally unfamiliar with. Sadly, I think this drives people away from philosophy. And so I want to make sure we try our best to define unique words and concepts to engage as large an audience as possible. My 11-year-old daughter is actually watching right now. And while I know she won't understand everything we discuss, I want her to at least follow along as much as possible. So I may ask you to define words or concepts or unpack them for the audience. And if I don't personally understand something that you mean, I'll admit that too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. So I think it would be a good place to start by defining some of these key words that we're going to be using a lot tonight. So I think the most obvious place to start is, what is determinism?
So determinism, I would define determinism as basically some sort of causal influence, and that this is not restrictive to theological determinism or psychological determinism, sociological, it doesn't matter. Any sort of causal influence in which necessitates your actions. And by actions, it means everything. So it's called determinism for a reason, because it necessitates everything. To put it a little bit more formally, instead of my just half definition, if I can find it here, I would define determinism to be everything that comes to pass is determined or necessitated by prior conditions. And I added causes there, which I think you can use them interchangeably, either supernaturally or naturally. That's a little bit more compact.
Yeah, great. I think less people are familiar with the word determinism. More people might be familiar with the term fate. Do you see a difference between fate and determinism?
Yeah, I do. And it's kind of frustrating that when specifically Molinists tell me to read The Only Wise God from William Lane Craig. And then personally, me, he just straight up strawmans the determinist the whole way through because he just keeps calling it fatalism. And I don't believe that determinism is fatalism because fatalism has a sort of connotation that is derived or is derivative of some sort of nihilistic tendencies where it doesn't matter what we do. Determinism, especially if compatibilism is true, that's just not the case. Especially if theological compatibilism is true, that's just not the case. Our actions do matter, and they are purposed for a specific reason underneath God's sovereignty. And so, yeah, I would definitely classify those two as different. Determinism is not fate by any stretch of the imagination.
Great. And you made a good point about this, is that there's actually determinism doesn't really tell somebody why you are a determinist, right? So
Yeah.
there's atheists who are determinists. So
Yeah.
I think we should narrow this down for our conversation, and I want people to understand what the Calvinism determinism is. And so I'm going to use a term, if you're okay, exhaustive divine determinism.
I'm sorry, go for it.
No, go ahead.
I know that some incompatibilists use that term. I like it in the sense that, yes, like it clears the air, like this is what you're holding to. But in the sense that I've heard you one time say, like, I don't like libertarian freedom because it's kind of redundant. To me, that's redundant. I mean, determinism, the reason why it has the ism on it is because it literally means everything. So if you hold to determinism, that does mean every single thing, your thoughts, your actions, everything is necessitated by prior conditions. So to say exhaustive in front of it, like I know Dr. Tim Stratton does that all the time on his free thinking ministries. To me, that's almost like confusing and redundant because you don't need that exhaustiveness there. If you claim determinism, you already claim the thesis that everything is determined. You can use it if you want, but I'm not going to use it.
That's fair. I just want people to understand. And so while it may be redundant, I think it helps. And adding the word divine, I think is helpful as well.
That's
because
true,
that's stating that you believe that the agent behind the causal determinism is God.
Sort of. So I don't think that determinism negates your agency. I would posit, and we can talk about it if you want, but I would posit at least that we have a soft agency. We don't have a hard agency like God does, in which he's the efficient cause. We are not, I would not claim we are the efficient cause. So if you mean by agent, like he is the efficient agent cause, then sure, but that doesn't negate or at least it doesn't negate some of our agency at all. Like we are still agents of morally responsible causes.
Yeah. What I meant was kind of more the ultimate determiner.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
And I think it would help here to, if it's okay, I want to quote the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Yeah.
I think most Calvinists, agree with the Westminster Confession of Faith. Tongue in cheek, I call it the Calvinist's Bible.
That's probably true, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think this will really help kind of set the foundation for our discussion. So you're obviously familiar with this. The audience may not be.
Yeah.
Chapter 3 in the Westminster Confession of Faith is called Of God's Eternal Decree. And it says, God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. So this is often referred to quickly as God's decree. This, to me, is a foundational aspect of Calvinism. And so I want people to understand what this means. So do you want to unpack a little bit what God's decree is in Calvinist theology?
Sure. So I mean, the Westminster is kind of vague in that, but essentially his decree, and I would say it's creative for a number of reasons, but his decree is essentially the thing that goes out, to try to make it a little less mundane and philosophical, the thing that goes out and makes everything to be. So in his creation of the world, that was part of his decree. Our actions are technically part of his decretive will in that sense. And so when we say theological or divine determinism, everything is part of that decree that God has decreed it to happen. And I don't think a Calvinist should shy away from that. If they do, I think they would be inconsistent. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. This is a little bit of an aside, but in the nature and the spirit of wanting to educate people, were you aware that historically Calvinists taught that God could not know the future unless he decreed it?
Yeah, I was aware. I do believe that to be true. So God cannot know the future until he determined it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I don't know if that, like, I do believe, let me rephrase. I know that they historically taught it. I'm not so sure I want to lean towards that position. But if he did create time, then it would make sense that he does already know the future. But this is getting kind of off of, not compatibilistic structure, and I get that. So
Yeah, great. And then just real quick, because a couple of quotes from some famous Calvinists on this topic. William Shedd wrote in his book, Dogmatic Theology, quote, "The divine decree is the necessary condition of divine foreknowledge. If God does not first decide what shall come to pass, he cannot know what will come to pass." Jonathan Edwards, another really famous Calvinist, from the works of Jonathan Edwards, said, quote, "The foreknowledge of God will necessarily infer a decree, for God could not foreknow that things would be unless he had decreed that they should be." And then lastly, A.W. Pink, in his book, The Sovereignty of God, said, quote, "Divine foreknowledge is based on the divine purpose. God foreknows what will be because he has decreed what shall be." So interesting. I ask Calvinists this a lot, and I get a lot of different answers. So I figured I would ask you, how do you define decree? Like a dictionary definition?
declaration. That's my simple answer. If decree comes, the etymology seems to be from a declaration, a divine order, if it were.
Yeah. Yeah. Divine order would be my preferred definition in the Calvinist model. Because obviously, a decree could come from a man. But yeah, in God's eternal decree from the Westminster Confession of Faith, I like that, a divine order. There's one word in that little section I read, which is that it says that God freely ordained whatsoever comes to pass. What does it mean that he freely ordained what comes to pass?
So he could ordain a number of possible worlds. So when people say counterfactuals are only for moleness, I would disagree. Middle knowledge is only for moleness, but counterfactuals are not just for moleness. Meaning God can still look through his divine decrees, not of creaturely freedom, but of his own freedom, in such a way that would maximize his glory. So he can look through a number of counterfactuals of possible worlds and say, well, this world wouldn't give me the most glory. This world has this in it, and that's not going to give me the most glory. So basically, he can choose depending on the world that he wants, depending on the divine decree, because he could have decreed a number of different moral reasons to actualize today, even for me or for you. He could have decreed a number of prudential reasons such as another palm tree in my backyard, or that my wife and I would have 5 cats instead of 2. He could do that, and those are different possible worlds, right? But I would believe he only decrees that one world in which maximalizes his glory because he's the maximally greatest being. So that is a necessary determinative influence within his nature.
Great.
Hey guys, sorry to jump in real quick, but we're hearing in the live chat that your mic is a little bit louder, Will, and Colton doesn't seem to be able to turn his up, right, brother? So would you mind turning your mic down just a little bit?
You know, I don't know how to turn my mic down, unfortunately.
Okay. All right.
Let me see if I can get into the settings here.
I don't think I can do anything on my end. Let me see.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not seeing a setting.
I can try taking my headphones off and seeing if that works.
You can try it. I don't know if that's going to be any better. You want to give it a go real quick?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that better? Sort of, kind of?
Not really. It's got a lot of feedback. You're a little louder, but it's got some more feedback. So we'll just kind of make do if we're not able to adjust it. So I'm going to back out, and you guys can just keep on trucking.
Great. So just to kind of put a bow on this, Colton, because I think God's decree is very important in this discussion, especially with determinism. So God decreed everything. So my question for you would be, is there anything that exists or has ever existed that is outside of the decree of God?
No. And a consistent Calvinist should say no.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. Yeah, I agree with you completely. So here's where I think people have issues. And when I say that, I am one of those people.
Okay.
And that's this. If God decreed everything, and we're talking everything exhaustively, I think people struggle to reconcile how then can free will exist, because you and I would both agree, if God's decree in Calvinism is true, then God decided before the foundation of the world how everything would play out.
Yeah.
And so if he decided how everything would play out, meaning he decided everything that we would ever do, think, say, etc., and it can't happen otherwise, how can that be reconciled with free will, which is, us thinking that we are actually determining what we say, think, and do?
Yeah, so I would just go back to the arguments that I've already made. Either Luther's Pelagian arguments that secures compatibilism to be true. If compatibilism is the thesis that moral responsibility and determinism can in fact be compatible, that argument not only just proves that compatibilism is, or that incompatibilism is false, but it also proves that compatibilism is true. So if that's the case, then to me that is evidence enough that they can be reconciled together. There's no logical contradiction in the fact that A, moral responsibility, and B, determinism, or even let's just say if one posits not A for determinism, A for moral responsibility and not A determinism, those two don't have, at least at first glance, except for if you assume things, don't have internal inconsistencies, don't have internal logical contradictions. So if people want to say, yeah, I know that's the hang up for compatibilism, like how can genuine freedom be true? If compatibilism is true, you are still responsible for your actions. So that's why I don't normally like saying that free will and determinism is compatible, although that's probably the most traditional. all we care about is that moral responsibility avenue. Like I think that's really what we care about. Like, how can we be morally responsible while I'm being determined? And if that's the case, then we can see, well, if free will necessitates moral responsibility, then let's just clear the waters, take moral responsibility into the thesis and work with that. And if that has been worked with successfully, as I think it has been done in the arguments that I've provided, then there is no reason, I believe, that a person shouldn't accept compatibilism, or at the very least, see it as rational. They may not want to see it as true. That's fine. Like, there's a difference between it being true and it being rational. It can still be rational, though they may disagree with it. I think you have your own agenda. Like, you want to be certain that people know what Calvinism is, and that's perfect. Like, I do too, right? My agenda would be, I'd rather clear the air and say, compatibilism isn't that naughty word, or determinism isn't that bad word, although some philosophers think it is. If compatibilism is true, then it doesn't really matter if you're determined. You're still morally responsible for it. Your actions do matter, and your life does matter. And for as Christians, obviously, it's a very big deal for us.
Yeah. So we don't have to talk about this, but I don't equate free will with morality exclusively.
Sure. Yeah.
I agree with you that the moral discussion is important, but I would say, so many choices of the will are amoral.
Okay.
And so help me out here if you can, and the audience as well, because here's where I'm struggling. So I ordered out today for lunch, and I picked a certain restaurant, and I picked a certain item on the menu. Now, I felt like I was choosing which restaurant I wanted to eat, which food on their menu that I wanted for lunch. But according to Calvinism, and if this is true, that was actually decreed by God before the foundation of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it that my choices essentially align with God's decree? And wouldn't you agree that I did not have the ability to do otherwise?
Sure. These are great questions. First of all, I would direct the audience to a number of works, a number of theories, and one of which is just guidance control and reasons responsiveness. John Martin Fischer and his colleague Mark Ravizza essentially has done an amazing job to articulate what is called the moderate reasons responsive view, in that we are morally responsible when we respond to reasons. Now, there's nothing that you said about you taking out lunch and working through your reasons that is actually incompatible with determinism. The agent can still recognize multiple reasons for doing action A. I can recognize I want to go to Chick-fil-A or Chipotle. I can recognize if I want to go to Jack in the Box, though it's kind of gross. I can recognize if I want to go to Wendy's or somewhere like a steak place and take my wife out. I can recognize those feasible reasons, but I only respond and receive one of them. And that the process of which I receive one of them is through what we call guidance control, and is through other things like our influences and so forth. Now, getting to your latter question, yeah, we couldn't have done otherwise. Categorically, we couldn't have done otherwise, but we could have done otherwise if we had wanted to. So I could have gotten Chick-fil-A even though I got Chipotle, or I could have gotten Wendy's even though I could have gotten Jack in the Box or something. Mm-hmm. So that if is the thing that's necessary for moral responsibility. And if that's the foundation, if all of us possess that conditional ability, then that means we are, if that is upheld, if that's not what's needed for moral responsibility, then the PAP, the categorical ability, does not need to be pressed. Because what I'm hearing you say is that the categorical ability, like I feel like I can actually regulate between option A and B, and I can freely choose option A or B, indeterminate of whatever options. And I would say you'd be hard pressed to try to prove that, but that's fine. I would say you can choose A and B conditionally, and that's all that's needed for someone to attribute moral responsibility. So whether or not you feel it, and that's the principle of credulity, basically, I see the external world until someone proves otherwise, and I'm confident and justified in believing that that's true. Yeah, that's true. You're right. And that should give pause to the compatibilist. However, if the compatibilism does give convincing evidence, such as an argument proving the truth of compatibilism, you have to deal with the argument. You have to go into the premises and you have to try to negate it. If you don't, then it's just wishful thinking and you're trying to build a philosophical system on just mere intuitions. And I would assert it doesn't work that way.
Great. I think the most important thing you said was that, and if I quote you incorrectly, please let me know.
Sure.
I think you said that you could have chosen differently had you wanted to.
Yeah, that's right.
We should talk about that. I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
So wants is kind of a synonym for desires. We could talk about, intentions, motives, etc. All of these things are very similar. Would you agree?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
When you say that you could have chosen differently had you wanted to, the issue I have and where I struggle to reconcile this is that your wants and desires were also decreed by God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't see where the freedom exists to desire differently, to want differently.
Sure. Again, there's no freedom to desire or want differently categorically. So if you mean like, oh yeah, then you don't have actual freedom as a Calvinist. If you mean categorical freedom, yes, you're right. Absolutely. I'm okay with saying that. But if I'm talking about the conditional freedom, then I would have to press you, then no, you're wrong. And that's why the compatibilist still says they believe in free will in a sense. And that sense is the conditional. Because the conditional, if it's shown that's the only thing necessary for rationality or for moral responsibility, then that's the foundation of our thoughts and beliefs, though God determined them. So you may say, well, if God determined your wants or desires, then how can you actually be responsible for your wants and desires? Well, if the conditional ability is the necessary foundation for moral responsibility in those wants and desires, then that question is just blown out of the water, it seems to me, because it's still assuming that determinism and moral responsibility cannot be reconciled. So again, one still has to deal with the arguments in such a way as to show that the conditional ability is therefore not the necessary prerequisite for moral responsibility. And then continue on with either the consequence arguments or some other incompatibilist argument.
Can you help me? Because I'm not following too closely on categorical ability versus conditional ability. Can you give an example of that?
Sure. So let's just say Sally's driving a car. Okay. So Sally's driving a car down an interstate and there's an exit and there's either you can go forward. Actually, let's do this one because it's a trolley problem. And I pose this to my students all the time. I love it. And similar to Sally. Let's just say Sally's on a trolley, right? It's going forward and she's just like la da 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 da. And then she sees 5 workers on the train track. Okay. And she can definitely continue on. But then she sees if she flips the switch, she goes to another train track and there's actually 1 worker tied to the rack. So that means she can continue on and then she kills 5 that are somehow roped on the track. And then there's 1, if she changes it, she can kill 1. Now, the question is, does Sally have the categorical ability to do otherwise? Yes. She can choose to stay or to not stay. If libertarianism is true, I would say that's true. She can choose to stay or not stay. That's what the categorical ability says. I can move and unfortunately run over the 5 people. Or I can change to a whole nother event to be this B track and kill that one person. Okay, so all things in and of themselves, Sally in the train, everything being equal to the moment of choice, she can choose genuinely 5 people or 1 person. That's what the categorical ability says. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so that's the categorical. Nothing's determined from her. She can move forward, unfortunately, hit the 5 people, or all things being the same, I can do this and run over the 1 person. The conditional ability says, I could run over the 5 people if I wanted to, or I could flip the switch if I had wanted to. Okay, so it's just that if there, or that given this, or I would have hit the 5 people if I didn't think reasons to not hit the 5 people. So I go over to the 1. Let's just say Sally has a reason to say like 5 people is better than 1, right? So I'm going to unfortunately kill the 1 because I don't want to kill 5. So she says those reasons are the things that are conditional upon her deliberated act. So she thinks those reasons and her act is deliberated upon going for the 1 person, or vice versa. So that's the conditional. The compatibilist says, in order to be morally responsible, the only thing that Sally needed to possess, the only type of ability, the only sense of ability that Sally needed to possess is the more modest conditional, not the high-end categorical. The categorical tries to prove that Sally could go track A, kill 5, or track B and kill 1. Okay. And then the modest, a sense of ability, the conditional, it's way down here. That type of ability, the compatibilist says, no. The sense of ability is not all the way up here. It's actually down here. And in this sense, the conditional, that's where Sally's morally responsible. And if that's true, then though she may be determined via her reasons or her desires at that time, she's still morally responsible.
Okay, so that yeah, thank you. That helps a little bit. We don't have to stay on this too much longer, but what I'm still missing is that you were talking about she has the ability to kind of think different things in order to influence her decision. Does that sound right?
Yes.
And I don't see that ability in exhaustive divine determinism because all of her reasons and thoughts and desires were already determined by God.
Yeah, if you presuppose an indeterminist worldview, sure. But if you say that she has a soft agency, that again, the sort of sleight of hand here, the indeterminist wants to put the agency all the way up here. I have to be the efficient cause of my action in such a way as to I can actually regulate or choose, all things being equal inside of me and outside of me, A or B. Okay. I need to have a strong sense of agency for that. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think you can ever have a strong sense of agency for that. In other words, this is often called agent causation. What you're saying is that you ought to be the efficient cause of your actions, right? But the problem is there's only one that has the true power to be the efficient cause of anything, and that is God. So all things need to be explanatory either within him or he explains everything else. So the principle of sufficient reason in a way. So he's the efficient cause of everything, which means secondarily, we are the formal and material causes. So the formal and material cause, this is Aristotle's 4 causes, by the way, if for the audience. It's efficient for number 1, 2 is the formal, 3 is the material, and then 4 is the final. And so I hold, because I see it in Scripture, if God is the author and finisher of our faith, then to me that seems very clearly He is the cause of our faith. John 6:44. He is the one who draws us in. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a Christian that really doesn't actually interpret that verse exactly how you see it. Maybe that's you, I don't know. But He's the one who draws us in. So He's the efficient cause. And then regardless of what we do in the material cause, like Arminians disagree with Calvinists in the formal and material causes. Like, well, regeneration precedes faith. Faith precedes regeneration. We actually choose. Like, that doesn't matter. You're still in the formal and material causes, which means all that's necessary for agency is for you to be the formal and material cause of your actions. If that's the case, then even though Sally couldn't have done otherwise, she's still within the formal and material cause. She has the ability to form her reasons in such a way through soft agency to materialize them into an outcome, either A or B, though God being the efficient cause of all of it.
Okay, so it appears that there's some connection. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears that there's some connection between our choices, our decisions, and our actions and God's decree. Would you agree? What is that connection?
So the connection between our choices and God's decree.
Yeah.
Well, first I would have to ask, why does a choice automatically mean indeterminism? I don't think you're implying that right now, but I know that's usually the general like go-to, like, oh, if you have a choice, you must be indeterminate. Why? God uses the secondary causation in such a way. He decrees the ends as well as the means, and in those means, He decrees for us in our soft agency, in our formal and material cause, for us to respond to reasons that we recognize, regardless of whether or not they're determined, for us to actualize such an event. So even a determinist can believe, a compatibilist can still believe one has agency. They have to, or else they're not responsible. You need to be an agent in order to be a responsible agent, right? So in that sense, God determines the secondary causes, just like the Westminster said. He uses secondary cause if we keep reading.
Right.
And He upholds it. It says that they're actually upheld. They're not diminished or vanished away. They're upheld. And those secondary causes, we are in the formal and material cause, and that's where moral responsibility lies. In those causes, we react to reasons, we recognize reasons, we receive them, and we choose via guidance control. I guide either the trolley to kill 5, or I guide the trolley to kill the 1, or I guide my reasons that were given to me conditionally to eat lunch at Chick-fil-A, to eat lunch at Chipotle, to eat lunch at my grandma's house, whatever.
Do you have an example, just for the audience? Mostly I'm familiar with the argument. Do you have an example of a secondary cause?
So I like to use the analogy from Newton's cradle. This is perhaps a really great analogy for me. I hope it'll be a good example. You have, if they're not familiar with it, you have the four balls essentially on a string. They're just kind of dangling there. And you pull one and you let go, and it just keeps going back and forth over and over and over again, right? That if there's 4 balls, those are the 4 causes. So the efficient one is the one that you pull. That's essentially, you're mimicking God in that sense. You're letting it go, right? So you're letting it go, and that energy is going through those 2 other balls in the middle to come out of the end ball. So those 2 balls in the middle is where moral responsibility resides, namely us, the formal and material causes. We form and materialize our decisions in such a way as to produce an outcome, but God is still the determiner of the outcome. because he grabs the ball to stop the process in eternity past. So he's the one on the end, the author, and he's the one, or at the beginning, the author, and he's the one on the end, the finisher. And we're the ones in the middle that where moral responsibility resides, where we recognize reasons, we guide things in, we're guiding that energy through those balls, through those two cradles there. In that sense, we're morally responsible. So I don't have an argument for it. Like I said, it's simply, if true, then moral responsibility and determinism can be compatible. If everything that I said was rational in a sense.
Yeah, so getting back to this idea that our actions, our desires, our thoughts are somehow connected to God's decree.
Yeah.
This is a question I've asked a lot of people, and I don't recall getting a satisfactory answer. And so obviously if you don't have one on the spot, that's fine too.
Okay.
But you mentioned in the very beginning of our discussion, the exact quote you said was, he could have decreed different worlds. So my question is, this is hypothetical, obviously.
Yeah.
My question is, why is it that had he decreed a different world, our actions would change?
So he could decree prudential reasons and moral reasons. So we are the moral agents, right? So we have a soul, we possess morality, and we exemplify moral things. To kind of do a side note, I don't want to get too off track of so stop me if I'm getting too off track, but you did mention that I don't really see me deciding Chick-fil-A or whatever, your lunch, as moral. Perhaps not. Your reason in and of itself was probably prudential, meaning stabilized or consistent, not necessarily moral. But I would say all our actions are moral, in the sense that you didn't lie while getting lunch. You were content. You were loving God as you should, as you're eating the lunch. You're glorifying in him as you're actually eating the lunch. So in that sense, yes, it is moral. As you're exemplifying the act, it is moral. So in that sense, God, when he decrees, I don't want to misrepresent you. So say it one more time. Just say it one more time.
Yeah. So hypothetically speaking, had God decreed differently, why is it that our actions would then change to conform to whatever he decreed?
So he could decreed a variety of different worlds, degrees almost. So he could have decreed world one, in which there is perhaps an unduly amount of evil in the world, that for morally sufficient reasons that we may or may not know, doesn't necessarily give him the most glory. Or he could have decreed world two, in which gives him more glory, either again through prudential or moral reasons. Maybe he wanted to. I've heard you say before, even could God actually make another butterfly if he wanted to? Yeah, prudentially he could. He could decree that prudentially if he wanted to. That could be in that possible world there. And so if that gave him the most maximum amount of glory, then sure, again, for reasons we may or may not know. And so he could go on and on and on, world 3, world 4, world 5, and so forth. And that his decree, his choosing is creative. But I would posit that there's only one world in which he receives the maximum amount of glory. That has it's similar to Molinism in the optimal worlds, but the maximum amount of glory in which the most are saved, and he is the one who's recognized as the ruler of all, given the tenets of Calvinism. In that world, he has to necessarily decree, because if it's for moral reasons, and since he's omnibenevolent, and he doesn't even have the choice to decree. So even here, we can see that God has the conditional ability to do otherwise, that he could decree a different world if he had wanted to, but he decrees this world in the actual sequence of events because this world is the most necessary for his connections for moral, for omnibenevolence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I like what you're saying, and it would be fascinating to discuss, but I don't think it's quite getting to what I want to get to. So I'm not trying to argue, why didn't he create a different world, or would one world be maximally greater than the other? I'm just merely saying, let me use your example. That might help. You brought up Chick-fil-A and Chipotle, so two great places to eat. So let's say that the actual world that we're living in, he decreed that we would have lunch at Chick-fil-A. Why is it, had he actually hypothetically decreed that you would have lunch at Chipotle, what would change your actions? Why would our actions change to conform to whatever it is God decreed?
So I don't want to, I'm going to try to repeat it back and see if that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So in connection to God's decree and our actions, you're asking, one, because you have been asking it for a while, what is the connection between God's decree of us choosing Chipotle over Chick-fil-A, right?
Yep.
And then the second part is what would change given God's decree?
Yeah, the second part is the most important of my question, which is, why is it that if God would have, and again, this is hypothetical, so I'm admitting that on the outset here, hypothetically, had God decreed differently, why is it that our actions would change to conform to his different decree?
So I think every possible world there is, we do differently. So we may do differently in world 1 or world 2, we may do differently. Let's just say in world 3, we go to Chick-fil-A instead of Chipotle, but in world 4, maybe this is the actual world, we go to Chipotle instead of Chick-fil-A. So in his creativity, he chooses the world in which maximally gives him the most glory. And that just so happens to be the actual state of events. World 4, in which we are determined to respond to reasons, to guide our behaviors in such a way as to conditionally choose Chipotle over Chick-fil-A. That's the actual world.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a slot. I think of it almost like, not a slot machine, almost like a jukebox. God has all these worlds available to him, okay? And there's only one that he needs to find, one that and I'm using almost human language here because he's not like actually finding them, right? But one he's trying to find to maximize the number of glory units, I would say. Let's just say hedonic units for his glory. Hedonic meaning, hedonism and for pleasure, for his glory, so that he can be still the maximally greatest being. And so he's searching through that slot box, and now every single slot, every single world has a different outcome. We go to Jack in the Box, we go to Wendy's, we go to Chick-fil-A. Hey, here's this one. We go to Chipotle, and this is the one that gives him the most glory. So he actualizes, he plays that one, and this is the one that we're in. As a Calvinist, I think I need to be consistent in saying that this is the best possible world. Otherwise, you would have unnecessary things all over the place, and that is just not determinism, right? Determinism is everything is necessary. So to preserve God's maximally great beingness and omnibenevolence, you need to say that this is the best possible world. And if we go to Chipotle, then great. We went to Chipotle on the best possible world, my friend.
So I think one thing you just said is key, which I think I wish I would have written it down, but I didn't. I think the phrase you used was guides our behaviors. This is uncanny. It's almost hard for me to believe, but in preparing for this discussion, I truly want to know what somebody believes. So I learned this from somebody named Brandon Craig, and he calls it going to the other side of the wall, meaning go on their side, forget what you believe, and just try to understand what they believe. And so I spent a lot of time, reading through Calvinists and listening to YouTube videos, etc. I actually listened to quite a bit of Guillaume Bignon, who you've mentioned, but this is uncanny. 5 minutes literally 5 minutes before I hooked in tonight, I found a quote from John Calvin that I had never seen before. And I think this is going to hit on your answer and the answer to the question that I'm asking. And so I just want to read this, get your thoughts, and then we could move on. So this is from his book. And obviously, there might be some people that don't know this, but Calvinism is named after John Calvin. His book, huh?
I just said surprise.
Yeah. So his book, this book that I'm quoting from is called Concerning the Eternal Predestination of God. So very relevant to our topic tonight. And here's the quote.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read this twice because, you know, people spoke differently back then, you know, hundreds of years ago. Here's the quote. The hand of God rules the interior affections no less than it superintends external actions. Nor would God have effected by the hand of man what he decreed, unless he worked in their hearts to make them will before they acted.
Yeah.
So one more time for the audience. The hand of God rules the interior affections no less than it superintends external actions. Nor would God have effected by the hand of man what he decreed, unless he worked in their hearts to make them will before they acted. So again, we're not going to solve all the world's problems today, but I can tell you, just for your knowledge and for everybody else's knowledge, that it's this idea that our will, our desires, our thoughts, our actions, etc., these are not the same thing, obviously, but they're all interrelated. The idea that God is, you know, really determining those things even before we're born, before the foundation of the world, a lot of people are going to have a natural struggle with how, A, that's even true, and B, how then could we have free will? So I'll let you have the last word on that if you want.
No, I think that's a great quote. I heard about it before, at least in pieces. I don't have that book though, but he says similar things in the Institutes, but not obviously as clear and cut as that one. To me, that's just straight guidance control. That's the actual philosophical term for it. I did have it in my opening statement, but because of time, I couldn't actually elaborate on it. But I have a huge 20-page document explaining what it is and how it responds to our reasons. But that's true. And I would like to add, because again, we want, like you said, we want the audience to understand what Calvinism is. I hear this all the time, that God works against our wills, especially in the moment of regeneration. And that is just blatantly false. That is unbelievably false. He works through our wills in regeneration so that we want to come to him at that moment. And in the same way, he works through secondary causes to guide us to Chipotle, Chick-fil-A, or whatever, depending on the actual world, the actual sequence that we're in, so that we may remain morally responsible conditionally in the formal and material causes of our actions. And so, yeah, I 100% agree with that quote from Calvin, and I think it upholds in a indirect way what the Westminster is talking about with secondary causes.
Great. Could I give you 2 verses in the Bible that I think are difficult from a compatibilist perspective?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
All right, cool. If you want to follow along, go to Genesis 4. The 2 verses, I really should call them passages. The first one's a passage. The second one is a verse. These are the 2 that kind of jump out at me right away, just as I was preparing for this discussion. So Genesis 4, I want to start in verse 4. And it says, Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. So I think if there was ever a verse showing libertarian free will, this is probably it. What I see here is I see here God telling Cain that sin is going to lie at the door, meaning he's going to have temptations. And God is saying that the sin's desire is for you, but you should actually rule over it. Meaning, if you have a desire to sin, you should rule over that desire and not sin. And so I'm not sure how, or if you've thought about this, or how you would reconcile this with the fact that the desires and then the actions that happen because of the desires are all predetermined.
Sure. Well, first of all, like I said, I'm a philosopher, and obviously I still do biblical exegesis. I'm just not amazing at it. But I will approach a text like this more philosophical. In that sense, I've heard a lot of incompatibilists say, this is a verse that proves libertarianism, or at least source incompatibilism, or whatever. And I would just have to point out one thing. God said, if you do this, then this will happen. That's a conditional. And if the conditional ability is necessary for moral responsibility, how is that incompatible with theistic compatibilism? Unless you inject a choice by begging the question that a choice necessarily entails indeterminism by reading the text. I mean, not only are you begging the question, but then you have to give a reason as to why that is, which means you have to give an argument for why indeterminism or choice is necessarily entails some sort of indeterministic fashion. Because I would say a choice necessarily entails a deterministic fashion. But again, I can't just assert that in a text. I would have to give an argument. So even in this text, the categorical ability, the thing that incompatibilists, I would argue, need in order to make their point, is just simply not there. It's not true that the categorical ability, all things being just as they are in Cain, inside and outside, he could have done otherwise. Or else why would God give him a conditional? If you do this, this would happen. Okay, that is a conditional. So God says, yes, you have to rule over it. That's true. You have to. We're still morally responsible. We must rule over it. Okay, but this does not entail that you have the ability to rule over it, at least not the categorical ability to rule over it. And then someone may say, well, that's preposterous. Why, you really want to read that in the text in Genesis 4? Is that how we have to read the text? No, I just think that's how you have to read maybe the Bible in context. We were given a law not so we can obey it, but so that we can see our sin and recognize our need for something other than ourselves, the efficient cause. We realize by the law that we, as an efficient cause, we cannot efficiently come to Christ. And that's the Calvinist position. We need something else other than the law telling us this is what's wrong, this is what's right. We need something else internally to guide our hearts in the direction of righteousness. And so, this verse, an ought here does not imply a can. And the incompatibilist assumes that an imperative therefore implies an indicative. And that's just not the case. There's no argument for that. It's just intuitively appealing.
Okay. I hear you. And I will admit that I do read this as God telling Cain that you have the ability to overcome the desire to sin. But let's go to the second one here, because I think we might be running out of time. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 10. This is probably, one of the most famous verses in the Bible. And again, I think this is a tough one for compatibilism. So verse 13 in 1 Corinthians 10 says, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it." And so what I read here is that we have the ability to be tempted and not sin. And God, it's referring to God as faithful, meaning he's not putting us or allowing us to be in situations where we're tempted beyond what we can bear and we have to sin. But with temptation, there's also a way of escape so that you do not have to succumb to the temptation. And if I look at this verse and then I look on this side at the fact that our desires, temptations, and choices are all predetermined, decreed by God, and we can't do otherwise, I can't reconcile that personally.
Sure. That's definitely a common concern. I've heard this verse all the time. I would have to press back, if you allow, and just say there's still a conditional lurking in there, that if God provided a way of escape, you could take it. So in that sense, yes, you're still morally responsible. I hear you. You're still morally responsible. I can still do this. But the problem is we don't know, we don't possess the epistemic access and insight into coming out of ourselves and seeing, yeah, we're determined on this line, though we are. And so we really don't have one option. In the moment of choice, we are still agents. We still make that decision. And the conditional is still true, that if God didn't provide a way of escape, then we would be left in our sin. And so in this verse, I completely agree with you. Like, praise God, he provides us a way of escape conditionally. And he didn't need to, but he did. I'd also like to add, though, that again, here, we're not the efficient cause. So it does say if God didn't provide it, analogously or conversely, if he didn't provide a way of escape, then that means we would be left in that one scenario, in that actual one scenario. True. Yeah, that's right. But again, like I said, praise God because he did. And so we are still morally responsible for choosing that one way of escape that God provides us. And just because he determines the guidance and the means of providing that escape does not negate our moral responsibility. You would have to first show that negates our moral responsibility for that verse to mean an indeterminist definition, or else you're just reading it into the text.
Yeah, let me ask you one final question on this verse,
Sure.
and I think we're out of time. In a situation where God has decreed that someone is tempted, then has a desire to sin, and then acts on the desire and sins in that situation, because obviously God didn't decree that we're constantly sinning every second.
Mm-hmm.
So in the situation, God decrees temptation, desire to sin, and then acting upon the desire to sin. In that situation, where is the way of escape?
So the way of escape, again, is just conditionally. So if you take the way of escape, then you are in the way of escape. But again, I'm saying if. So if you take that way of escape, then you have the escape. If you don't take the way of escape, then you don't have the way of escape. So again, if the conditional ability is all that's necessary for moral responsibility, it's not that, oh, I'm no longer morally responsible because God determined me to do this one action. And because I don't have two escapes, therefore, I'm toast. I am like evil God that is for basically determining me to do one action. That's completely missing the point. And I would almost kind of push back and say it's a little bit too emotional in the sense, if the conditional ability says, if this were true and then this would happen, that's all that's needed. So if that conditional ability is true in the philosophical realm, I go to this verse as a Christian, as a Calvinist, and I see that as true. Okay, God gave me a way of escape. He is the efficient cause, but that does not negate my formal and material causes of providing the way of escape, providing the avenue in which to escape, though that escape route was already given to me by God in the first place. And if I revert back and go back in time and say, okay, well, I'm not going to take the way of escape. I'm going to divulge into temptation. You may want to be tempted and saying, well, then God's determining you to sin. Evil God that is. Well, if we're morally responsible for that sin, how is he evil? Well, he's causing you. Then I would push back even more that you need to give a slight definition on why causal responsibility always entails moral responsibility. And until and unless I see that happens, then again, it's just question begging.
All right. Really enjoyed this, guys. I feel like we're still in the meat of the conversation. So I hate to cut you off. We really don't have a ton of questions. Would you guys be okay with going maybe 10 minutes more? I don't know what time you guys have to wrap it up, but and then if both of you are able to do that, and I know you've been asking most of the questions and just kind of trying to get the audience, myself included, to understand all of this. And I feel like you're doing a good job, both of you guys, because I'm beginning to understand both sides of it. But Colton, if you want to ask some questions of Will, the questions that we do have mostly in the comments are for you, Colton. So if you want to go ahead and ask some questions of the other side, then you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, Will, you can kind of keep asking questions, however you guys want to work it out. And we'll just go till 10:40. And at that point, we'll wrap it up.
Great. Hey, Colton, this is an interesting one that I was thinking about. So philosophy has helped me understand falsifiability.
Yeah.
And falsifiability to me is a good thing. A lot of people immediately get defensive when they hear the term because they think that you're somehow saying you're trying to disprove something, and it's like no. Falsifiability is meaning is something testable. Is it falsifiable? And so I often, with my own beliefs and my own theologies, will try to figure out, okay, what would actually falsify my beliefs? And what I think is pretty neat is Paul actually gave in the Bible a way to falsify Christianity. He said, if Christ did not rise, our faith is in vain. And so this is an exercise that I think is helpful. Have you ever considered if it's possible to falsify compatibilism?
Yeah. One, deal with the arguments and then reject a premise for a certain other premise. That's the first part. That's why we put them in syllogistic form. So if someone wants to reject it, say, this is the reason why I reject it. I mean, for whatever reason that is, then it's therefore falsifiable. But more importantly, I think this is the killer. If anyone wants to falsify compatibilism, find a sufficient condition for moral responsibility. It's extremely difficult. The only one that I know that has tried to put it in writing is Robert Cain, and not a lot of philosophers took well on it. And Robert Cain is a libertarian, and so he was the one who tried to do a sufficient condition for moral responsibility. It's extremely difficult to do, but if you did do that, and if you showed that the categorical is actually sufficient for moral responsibility and not even necessary, well, then it kind of blows the conditional ability out of the water, and then the whole argument for compatibilism kind of just crumbles down. So if anyone wants to falsify a Calvinist, the philosophical system of Calvinism, then that would be what I would tell them: find a sufficient condition for moral responsibility.
Interesting. Do you have a way? Do you have a way to falsify compatibilism, referring to just free will in general and not specifically moral responsibility?
Such as free will being compatible with determinism? That definition?
Yeah, absolutely, exactly.
I probably would say the same thing. I would have to think about it a little bit more, but I'd probably say the same thing, because to me, free will and moral responsibility are not necessarily synonymous, but they're highly close together. At least in the philosophical literature, you see them almost used interchangeably from big time philosophers. And so I would kind of say the same thing. If anyone wants to disprove the thesis of compatibilism, that free will is compatible with determinism, if they want to disprove that in favor of incompatibilism, you would have to first show that there is perhaps a sufficient condition for moral responsibility, or even if you don't want to do any moral responsibility, just show that there's multiple options. Compatibilism necessarily entails, which means it requires, determinism. If you're a compatibilist, you are a determinist, hands down. Okay?
Right.
So if determinism by definition means one action, if you prove that there's more than one action, then determinism falls. And if determinism falls by modus tollens, so does compatibilism.
So with that premise, wouldn't your comment that God could have decreed different worlds disprove it then?
God could have decreed different worlds conditionally, but remember, he's morally responsible to decree the only one world that maximizes his glory. So there's only one option in which God could have decreed. He couldn't have, in the sense that for moral reasons, he couldn't have decreed otherwise, because he's morally bound by his nature. So he can't decree a world in which he's not receiving the most glory, okay? Because his glory is inextricably bound by his moral nature. And that's what makes him a simple God. That's what makes him the maximally greatest being. So in that sense, yes, he could have conditionally decreed a different world other than this world, which I posit to be the best possible world. But given his moral nature, given his omnibenevolence, given his glory, and his maximally greatness as a being, he needed to decree this world.
It sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you don't believe God has free will then.
I don't really want to, if I'm pressed, I will go into it, but I don't believe he has, as of right now, and I could be proven wrong, and I'm totally open for that. As of right now, I don't believe he has categorical freedom. No.
Wow.
He is within his nature. He is determined to do whatever his nature determines him to do, but he still has freedom within those options. I wouldn't even say that. If you look at someone like Dr. Tim Stratton and his definition of libertarian freedom, we may disagree on the nuances of that definition, but it's slightly close to what I hold. He just doesn't jump over the hill and call himself a full compatibilist. Okay, he says he's like a halvesy, like libertarian and compatibilist. That's fine. I jump over the hill and I see a necessary determining factor within his will, within his nature, within his attributes. That prompts.
Yeah, I would say that for me, and I'm sure there's going to be some people that would agree, the idea that God had to create, or the idea that God had to create the exact world that he did, severely limits him.
Yeah, I heard you say that before again, that you find comfort in God's ability, right? And God's ability and openness and security. And then often Calvinists can find comfort in his inability or something like that. And honestly, I would say, sure, I guess, if you want to say like, yeah, God is, you've said it before, omnicompetent. He's omnicompetent, and he can be, he can decree, or not decree, but he can basically creatively do whatever this, that, however your position is articulated. That's true too. I wouldn't negate that God is omnicompetent. I personally wouldn't, just because he doesn't have the categorical ability to do otherwise does not entail that he's not omnicompetent in that way of him creatively decreeing the world that is to come.
So if God had to create this exact world, based on your argument I'm going off of here, if he had to create this world, doesn't that in a weird way mean that you so Colton Carlson, are necessary for God to exist?
No, not at all. It just says God needed to create something. So I take, if you have the ability as a theologian to say God is omnicompetent, I have the liberty to say as a philosopher that God is omni-artistic. Okay, like artistry is part of his. That's why we call it a creative decree. Artistry is part of who he is. He could have prudentially, and I would even say categorically, chosen to produce more butterflies than not, because those don't depend on his nature. They're prudential reasons. It's just stability. It has nothing to do with whether or not the moral aspect of his nature is grounded. So he could have created 5 million different other butterflies, or more palm trees in my backyard, me having 2 cats, 2 Chipotles out my front door. I don't know. He could have decreed those sorts of prudential reasons, more stars in the universe or whatever. In that sense, he has the ability, the categorical ability to do otherwise. What he doesn't have the ability to do otherwise, the categorical ability to do otherwise, is determine a world in which he doesn't receive maximum glory. He must determine a world that receives maximum glory. If that involves us, primarily, I would have to push back. It's like, no, it's secondary. He didn't need to create us. He could have created butterflies, and he would still be maximally glorious, I guess, in that world. But if he wanted to create moral beings, he was therefore necessarily bound by one world, but not bound by us, just bound by the world in which he needed to create through his nature.
Yeah, I appreciate your honesty here. Because again, people are always going to disagree, and it's fun to hash these things out. But I think that people should realize, and maybe not every Calvinist would agree with you, but I think a majority of them would, because I've heard this before, that God really, this was the one world that he had to create for whatever reason. So,
yeah.
Right. Awesome, guys. That was super interesting. It held my attention the whole time. So we kept out about the same number of viewers. So it looks like you held their attention too. So that's awesome. We got a couple questions in, and I got a couple questions of my own, and then we'll let you off the hook. And some of these you may have kind of answered. I'm just going to kind of read them as I got them. And so we'll just let you answer it. Okay, it looks like this one is for you, Colton. We all know the claim of compatibilism, but can you offer an explanation for how we are morally responsible if we have no free agency to make a choice? I think you've kind of answered it, but if you want to rehash it, you can.
I think the question implicitly assumes that hard agency is necessary for any choice to come about. So I'd have to push back on that and just simply ask why. Why are you convinced that that's the case? But even more so, the argument I presented in the opening statement is Luther's Pelagian argument. If that's true, the thesis of compatibilism maintains. The thesis itself, from the definition of incompatibilism, is therefore necessarily true. And it's deductive, so you can't escape it. You have to go through the premises and negate one of the premises and follow as such. If you want to talk about the premises, that's fine. We can talk about it. I have a defense, and I've posted defenses on Facebook before. I've written them out before. That's fine if you want to do that, but I would say go back, because the hard agency is a non sequitur when it comes to compatibilism, at least not for the argument I'm using, and the thesis would still maintain.
Okay. Will, if you want, I'll just kind of let both of you answer the question, or if you want to give any feedback, you can.
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
I think we hit that one enough.
Okay. So Will, this one's for you. Isn't the way of escape only applied for believer, mainly in terms from apostasy? So wouldn't that entail only believers have libertarian free will? Do I need to?
I think I know what they're saying, and I don't think it's valid. Obviously the direct audience here were the people in Corinth. So this is referring to 1 Corinthians 10:13, I believe. The issue is, if we want to say that this only applies to believers, which I don't think is the case, but let's just say that we do. It still would refute, in my opinion, compatibilism, because the determinism is not, determinism does not respect a certain people. Determinism is not a respecter of persons. It is exhaustive. It applies to everyone. And so I think either way, if somebody wants to interpret this as applying to believers only, the argument still stands. I don't think so, but either way, I would make the same argument.
Okay. Colton, anything on that?
No, I would agree.
Okay.
I think to be consistent, you would have to either adopt Will's position or mine. Personally, I've always said that the most consistent sociological systems should be open theism and Calvinism. Now, the Arminians in the room are going to have an uproar, whatever. It's okay. If I wasn't a Calvinist, I'd probably lean more towards open theism because of just the consistency. And if you interpret the verse consistently, then yeah, I would go with Will's answer.
Okay, it looks like this is along the same line of the same verse. It would have been for you, Colton. If you're determined to sin, how did God provide you a way of escape?
So this has to do with his decretive will and his prescriptive will. So yeah, his prescriptive will is the sense that he wants you to take the way out. That his law is the prescriptive will. He wants you to succeed. Yay. He's the mom on the side cheering your soccer on. I don't know. He wants you to succeed, is what I'm saying. In that sense, yes, the prescriptive will maintains. The decretive will is the will that it's either you do this or do that, in which, no, you're right, you don't have a categorical ability to do otherwise. But I say that doesn't matter. The only thing that you need is the conditional. And in that verse, there is a conditional. And if that's all that's needed for me to take a way of escape and to show that I have moral responsibility, then sure, that doesn't refute compatibilism. And actually, it upholds it.
I'll respond to that real quick. This is obviously a discussion for another time, but I don't see a decretive will and a prescriptive will biblically. And what's interesting is that we actually have a head start on this debate because there's two Greek words for will. One is boulomai and one is thelo. And I've actually challenged Calvinists to this, which is to tell me which one is decretive and which one is prescriptive. And I've never really had an answer, because if once they determine which one is which, we go through the Bible and it doesn't fit their definition. So again, sorry to open up a can of worms that we can't discuss, but maybe another time.
Yeah, I would love that.
Okay, this one's for you, Will. And I assume you'll probably know what this means because I don't. I'm not a philosopher, but I'll ask it anyway. For Will, do you believe in the PSR, and what does that imply? The choices have an explanation, almost imply that it is determined.
So as you may remember, I'm a wannabe philosopher, so I don't even know what PSR is. My apologies there.
The principle of sufficient reason. So everything needs a sufficient reason for its, I guess, coming about. So the world's sufficient reason, if you've heard of the Kalam cosmological, in a way, the sufficient reason for the world coming about is God. He is the sufficient reason. So every contingent thing needs a sufficient reason, them being a necessary thing.
Okay, so now that you've defined that, what's the question?
Okay. Do you believe in the principle of sufficient reason, and what does that imply? The choices. Sorry, I kind of run on. The choices have an explanation. Almost imply it is determined. Maybe I can put that on the screen.
So here's what I would say. And again, this is a new term for me, so I'm going off the cuff here. Oh, that does help. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
After the fact, we can look back and say, what was the cause of this? What was the cause of that? In my opinion, just because something has a cause doesn't mean that the cause was determined. So I would look at what I think is the best example of showing indeterminism, and that's the will. And so I would say that the will has I define will, by the way, or free will as the ability to decide. So I would say that a will has the ability to decide. It can do A, it can do B, C, D, whatever. After the fact, yes, we could say the will made that decision, but I don't believe that that decision is determined. So that's my answer.
Okay. This is maybe kind of similar, but I'll let you read it right there.
Yeah, so this is Derek. I know Derek, which makes this question a little bit more fun. So can freedom be determined and ordained? Interesting question. I don't think this is what you're asking, Derek. So I'm going to answer this one first. And I would say that for God to be truly sovereign means that he can actually give people true libertarian free will. I don't think that's what you're asking. I think you're asking, I think you're actually getting right to the heart of compatibilism, which is, can determination and free will be compatible? And I would say no to that. So whichever one you mean, I think I gave you an answer, but no, I would say that if something is determined and it's ordained, and there is a lack of an ability to do otherwise, that there is no freedom there. So that's the heart of what we're debating tonight.
Right. And so Colton, that's exactly what you've been saying is possible, right? Yeah. This whole time.
Well,
okay.
In a sense, yes. Like God can decree in a certain way, determine freedom. And I personally think, and this may get a pushback too, that's what Molinism is. But still, the question, I agree with Will, that doesn't mean that the creatures are therefore no longer free. In that actual world, they are still free. So it depends on God's foreordination or foreknowledge, and it goes into questions like that. Yes, God can predestine or determine or actualize an agent's actual free will. But does that make them actually free or not free? I wouldn't say it doesn't make him not free, especially if you put middle knowledge in the picture.
Okay, and just two more, and these are going to be my own questions. And again, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm pretty new to the whole compatibilism debate. So, and you touched on this a little bit, Colton, and I'm just going to revisit it and try to wrap my mind around it.
Okay.
But like tonight, I went to Taco Bell, right before this debate. And just imagine a world where everything is exactly the same as this world. All past events, everything is exactly the same, except for, like, instead of going to Taco Bell, I decided to go to Sonic, which is just right across the street. So everything the same. If I could have gone to Sonic with everything the same, is God's influence like the only difference between those two worlds? Does that make sense?
Sort of. Let me try to unpack it, and you can tell me if I'm answering it correctly or not. Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure.
So the only difference, if everything being the same, the categorical ability is the only difference, God's influence. That's what you're saying, right?
Right.
Sure. Now the real question is, how influential is that influence? Is it a strong influence, such as it determines you to do Taco Bell, and then you have the conditional ability to do otherwise? Or is that influence a weak sort of influence? And I would take that to be honestly the Molinist position. They weakly actualize the world, but yet you're still categorically free to do otherwise. So your question, I think, hits at the antecedent of the debate, but it doesn't get to the necessary consequent, and that is really the heart. And how does God actually actualize a world? Does he do it weakly, such as Molinism, or does he do it strongly, like in determinism, or does he do it at all, like in open theism, in a sense? And so that's really what I would say to that. If you have any follow-up questions, then I can perhaps answer.
I don't know. Will, what are your thoughts on that?
I like your question a lot. And I think that if we really were to spend a lot of time on this, look at your question under a microscope, I think the answer would be yes, that the only difference there would be God's influence. And again, God can influence people in different ways. Like, we're not saying, God is going to miraculously, direct you or move your car and make it go a different direction. But yes, I think the answer is yes. God's influence is the difference between those two worlds.
Okay. All right. The last question, this is a question that I'm going to ask pretty much everybody that comes on, because the name of my channel is Practical Faith, right? So this is for both of you, but why does this discussion really matter? How do these things impact us? Or is it, our view of God, or what does it matter at all? And then Will, if you want to go first, if that's okay, and then Colton.
Yeah, so for me, this topic matters because ideas have consequences. We have examples of people, both, Christians who left the faith and atheists who, are atheists and are not Christians, who have this belief that if everything is determined and set and can't be changed, then what's the point? Why do this? And so for me, again, I'm assuming that I'm in the right here. But if my belief is that the future is open, it's not settled. And I also believe that anyone can be saved, and that it's not a preset certain number of people that will be saved. And so for me, that's important, is making sure that everybody understands that there is a God, there will be consequences for sin, and until you die, you have the opportunity to repent.
All right. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
All right, get a little feedback. All right, I don't know what changed there. All right, Colton, do you want to try to answer that question? If I don't know if we're going to continue to get feedback or not.
Sure.
Let me see if you muted either one.
There it is.
Okay, I muted you, Will. I don't know what it is, but go ahead, Colton.
I think Will said it pretty much correctly. I mean, we are morally responsible regardless. And so regardless whether or not you fall into whatever camp, soteriological camp, open theist, Arminian, Calvinist, it doesn't matter, because we're still morally responsible. In that sense, it's practical. We need to know what sort of world God initiated, in a sense, and so that we can explain this better to unbelievers. We can give them even a brief account for this, and whether or not they will like it, whether or not, like Will suggested, that even some have fallen because Calvinistic is too hard deterministic for them. Sure, we still need to tell them the truth, and if the Bible does teach whatever we land on, then we need to teach whatever we believe that the Bible is teaching. I think to be even more genuine, you could, and I've even done this before, when you're talking to an atheist, I've had certain people who said, like, well, if I become a Christian, I don't believe in libertarian freedom. Like, is that going to be a problem? Like, just because I'm a Christian, do I need to believe in libertarian freedom? No, not at all. You can be a Christian and not believe in libertarian freedom. They actually have a whole camp for that. It's the Calvinist camp. But I've also had some people, some other unbelievers say something similar, that, I believe in that we're actually free and that everything happens for a good reason, but I can't reconcile, the Calvinist God with all the evil in the world and us, I guess, being morally responsible. Then again, I've said, sure, there's other positions out there, such as the Arminian position, and they have a great theodicy to use. It's called the free will defense. I don't personally use it because I can't, just because it doesn't jive well with the Calvinistic system, but that's a whole nother story. But I can still say that, yes, there is this other camp. So I think it helps with evangelism. It helps with teaching others not only the historicity of Christianity and the different camps and breakdowns, but also it prepares their minds for like analytical theology and just mere dabbling into the philosophical nuances that this discussion has, just like Will was saying at the very beginning. And that should be encouraging for anyone, practically.
All right. Will, I'll just let you say bye real quick. Your battery's going down.
No, my battery. I'm not even out of it.
Hey, you're good now. I don't know. Someone said Satan in the feed. I don't know. But yeah, I want to say thank you guys both for coming on. If you got kind of a final departing word or something, you can go ahead and Will, you start, and then I'll let Colton, you have the last word. But I wanted to say to both of you, thanks so much for coming on. I think that you're representing your positions really well. And I think you've made all of us think a little bit deeper about these issues. And at the end of the day, we are on the same side. So it's good to see you come together and just discuss these, what can sometimes be divisive topics in such a brotherly way. And there's nothing, no kind of tension or anything between you guys. And I think that's awesome. And I'd like to see more of that stuff. So we'll go ahead and then Colton.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cole. I actually prepared just a short paragraph to finish with, just to kind of sum up my whole thoughts on this discussion. The Bible teaches that we can change our thoughts and desires, and God even commands that we do. For example, one of the 10 commandments is do not covet. Coveting is desire of the wrong things. So the Bible says if we pray for wisdom, we get more wisdom. It's like exercising our muscles. As we exercise our faith, we grow stronger in Christ. As we think of those things that are pure and not fleshly things, increasingly we can, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5, bring our thoughts into captivity to the obedience of Christ.
Amen. Colton?
Yeah, I would just like to say thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for Will, for just being a great brother and always challenging me. So I appreciate that. And I guess to the audience, the one thing I just press is the resolution is compatibilism rational? Not that it's true. And so I think that's very interesting to say. I didn't argue, at least the majority of the time, that it is true, although I believe it is. I only had one single argument, my whole opening statement, showing that it is true, and it was a reformulation. All the rest of the things I said essentially is just jiving well with the thesis that compatibilism is rational. If I can show that compatibilism is at least rational, and that jives with a good majority of the biblical data, maybe not all of it, but a good majority, and then we have to search it out however we need to, and then has good theological reasons and good philosophical foundations, then I think I did my job as a Calvinistic philosopher. I didn't want to prove compatibilism to necessarily be true. I just wanted to show that it was rational. And in that, you can decide. You can go back through the video and decide. Like Cole said, we're all Christians here. We all love the Lord. We all seek for truth. It's not one side or the other. It's not like, oh, I'm the Calvinist, I'm going to root for him, or I'm the open theist. Like, we are all seeking truth. And that's, I think, the most important thing.
Amen. Well said, guys. Really enjoyed it. Thanks again for coming on. And I'm just going to send us off here. And if you got just a second afterwards, may holler at you. But if you need to just jump off, that's cool too. But thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.
Sure. Bye.
All right. That was awesome. I enjoyed that debate. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. This is not necessarily a debate channel, but I do want to remind you that I do have another debate coming up in about 2 weeks, 2 weeks from tomorrow, which is in about an hour. The Romans 7 debate, Nick Quint versus David Lewis. Is this the Adamic nature or the Christian struggle? So that's coming up. If you're interested in that, please subscribe. And in about a week, then I'll be putting that out there, and you can set a reminder for it. So also, if you're interested in debating, I like hosting this. I'm not very good at it, but I like hosting this stuff. And so if you are interested in taking a position in a debate, then let me know what topic you're interested in debating and what side you would be on. And maybe I can pair you up with somebody else, and we can do that in the future. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you have, please subscribe, turn on the bell notifications, give this video a thumbs up. And until next time, thanks for watching.